Hi there, and welcome to Mackinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahili, and I'm back this week to moderate today's discussion on investing in Black lives and livelihoods, and specifically on what stakeholders can do at this vital juncture to help transform the health and wealth of Black Americans. We hope you find our conversation useful and actionable, and of course, most important, that all of you remain safe and well as lockdowns begin to lift across the globe. As we begin, just a quick acknowledgement of the national conversation that has been galvanized over recent weeks in the United States and globally about persistent racial violence and injustice and their impact on Americans in general, and obviously on Black Americans in particular. What's more, the killing of George Floyd and this global grief and anger and pain that it has so meaningfully surfaced came in the context of the sudden and exogenous shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. And obviously the effects of COVID are still evolving. But there was just an article in the New York Times this past weekend, the 4th of July weekend, suggesting again that COVID-19 is exacting an outsized toll on the lives and livelihoods of the African American community. So, this tragic and completely destabilizing constellation of events has acutely heightened awareness of these long-standing and systemic racial inequities, and on the positive side, has compelled a range of stakeholders, policymakers, employers, academics, individuals, finally to ask, what next? How best can we help now? Joining me today is Jason Wright, a partner in McKinsey's operations practice and an expert on leading large-scale transformational change. Jason will talk to us today about what our research reveals about racial disparities and their effects on Black Americans' health and wealth, and what we can do at this inflection point to start to make this right. Jason, thanks for joining us, and welcome to McKinsey Live.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here. Well, let's hop in, shall we? Great. So just to reintroduce, I'm Jason Wright, a partner in our operations practice. I wear two hats at McKinsey. I lead our G&A operations work in the Americas, which is not why you're here listening today. But I also lead our internal think tank on the U.S. racial wealth gap. And we're going to hop into some of that content. So today, the median Black family has $17,000 in wealth. The median white family has $171,000 in wealth. So the gap is 10x. And the implications of that are twofold. There's human impact, which is downward pressure on socioeconomic mobility. So if you are a Black person born middle class, you are less likely to end up in middle class at the end of your life than you are likely to be in that, and that is not the same for other populations. And that's well documented. But there's also a case for the economic impact, and that the U.S. economy itself is constrained as a whole due to this racial wealth gap, and that's where we leaned in as McKinsey with the lens we bring around data and analytics. And so on the next slide, you'll see the results of an economic model that we ran. And we said if you were able to close the racial wealth gap, and we ran this in 2018, if you were able to close the racial wealth gap over 10 years, at the end of that, depending on your assumptions, if you're an optimist or a pessimist about how the racial wealth gap grows over that period of time, it's worth between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion annually. That's run rate in GDP. That's 4 to 6% of GDP. That's larger than any of the last four economic expansions in the U.S. And this is money that would go into everyone's pocket. This is Black businesses, brown businesses, white businesses, rainbow businesses, everybody's businesses. This is not taking from one group and giving to another. This is actually growing the overall economic pie. And as we pivot to talking about COVID, this is especially germane, knowing that all of us as business leaders and as U.S. citizens and global citizens want to see a sharp V recovery coming out of COVID-19 instead of a more protracted one. And any drag that would be there from the racial wealth gap will especially hurt in that moment. And so the next slide. This overarching headline started to inform our subsequent research. And what we found is that these disparate economic outcomes across Black America really can be tracked across what we call the wealth building journey. Now, this is the wealth building journey for everyone, but we've taken a Black lens to it. So there's 4 parts to it. There's the community context. These are the neighborhoods, counties, municipalities in which Black people live and work and find the starting point of their lives. And Black people and Black families are 4.6 times more likely to live in areas of high concentrated poverty compared to white families. And that is not as stark, but even when you adjust for socioeconomic background or income, there is still an outsized component that is racial versus just socioeconomic. And so when you move from community context to family wealth are the assets that a Black family or Black individual starts with in their lives and builds up over time. This could be things like inheritance, money that's been passed down, but it also includes Black-owned businesses, which are often a major driver of held wealth within Black families. And if you are a Black-owned business, you are 2 times more likely to be at risk or in financial distress than a white-owned business. And we'll come back to that later in the context of COVID. We move from family wealth to family income. This is over the course of a person's lifetime, how they participate in the labor market and earn money that can build on the wealth that they had started off with. And over a lifetime, a Black worker is likely to make $1 million less on average than a comparable white worker, or on average, a white worker. And then if you move down to family savings and support, this is how, through participation in financial institutions and financial systems, family income is converted to wealth over time. And the stat we have here on the page is that an average Black individual spends $40,000 more over the course of their lifetime due to fees, overages, excessive interest, and other things that make participation in the financial system inequitable. And so we'll come back to that as well in the context of COVID, where liquidity is especially important to survive now as a family and as an individual. And so we frame all this in the racial wealth gap because it's very germane to what's happening now within COVID. And so we'll go to the next slide.
Jason, before you move on, we've gotten an interesting question here. These statistics are super powerful, but could you say something maybe in one of these areas at least about what this translates into in terms of the lived experience of Black Americans and Black American families?
Love that. Let's flip back to the previous slide. I like that a lot. So on the family savings and support, one of the analyses we did in one of our reports, the Case for Financial Inclusion in Black America, we have it in there in a vignette, is what does a month or 3 months in the life of a Black family look like, the average Black family, compared to the average white family? And we did this running some of the data that we were able to do in a primary research way and stuff that we collected in meta-research. So if you have 2 families with the same median income and their starting point, and the only difference is race, the first differential as they're going through the course of their month is that the Black family pays a slightly higher mortgage than the white family. Because even when you account for income and all of that, the interest rate tends to be higher on a Black family than it does on a white family. Sometimes for reasons of neighborhood, other times for reasons that can't actually be explained with a good rational explanation. But in the data, objectively, they're going to be paying a higher mortgage. So your discretionary income or what's left over starts to get eaten away at. Then, even once you account for student loan burden overall, the percentage, again, the interest rate is typically higher for Black families, and the default rate tends to be higher for Black families as well. So both the overall student loan burden and once you account for overall student loan burden, the interest rate is higher on a Black family. And so, again, eating into discretionary income. Same thing with credit card rates, higher for Black families with lower balances on average and more likely to default. And then you start to look at the positive side, which is participation in financial instruments. And the average Black family has savings accounts and maybe a 401k through their job. The average white family has some participation with a financial advisor or other method to get into more sophisticated financial products. And so what's being made passively is greater for the white family, and for the Black family stays sort of stable. And then here's the big swing. There's a large differential in healthcare and life insurance coverage between white families and Black families. And so when little Billy breaks his arm, If little Billy is white, healthcare coverage typically covers it. The family moves on, and there's a small dent, if not just an inconvenience, of a whiny kid around the house complaining about an itchy arm under a cast, right? However, for a black family where the healthcare coverage is not robust, again, adjusting for all of the income variables, this is where that differential can cost the family a ton of money, start to take them into the red, and force them into alternative financial products to get liquidity and cash in the moment. And we'll talk about this later, the access to capital gap that exists even for affluent families. And as a result, you start going to payday loans and other services that put a spiral in place that ends up being a debt burden that black families can't get out of or have trouble getting out of. And so I think that paints the picture in a more lived way of what this feels like.
Absolutely.
Right. All right, well, let's talk about COVID then. And I'll bridge this by saying the roots of the racial wealth gap are also the roots of the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black America. And so back in February, our team ran an analysis, working with some of our healthcare practitioners, and said, we think that there are 5 factors that are likely to predict a county having an outsized impact of COVID-19, an outbreak, more deaths, more infections. And we thought there were 5 factors that would underlie that. Underlying conditions, comorbidity rate is number 1. Poverty rate, number 2. Population density, how closely packed in folks are. The percentage of residents with severe housing problems, that can either be housing conditions or even multi-generational families. And then the number of ICU hospital beds as a proxy for the overall capacity of the healthcare system in that area. And when we looked at this on a county-by-county level, the 127 counties that were in the bottom decile in these scores, in our aggregate score, 10% of all Americans live in those counties. 18% of Black Americans live in those counties. And Black Americans represent just under 12% of the population at last census. And so we're overrepresented in those areas. And when we ran this model back in February, we predicted that Black people were 1.4 times to 1.8 times more likely to experience severe consequences of COVID from a health standpoint, directly or in their families. And to date, it is borne out to be about 1.7 times. So it's one of those things where you hate to be right. And this is unfortunate, but this was also predictable because we saw all of this rooted in the economic inequities that underpin all of this. And so we'll go to the next slide. When you take a double click in as to why this is, there's a lot more data here that we have in our report on COVID-19 in Black America, but 3 examples of the systemic inequities that have driven this. Number 1, again, Black people are about 12% of the overall U.S. population, but we represent 20% of workers in low-wage, high-contact, essential jobs. These are folks on the front line facing COVID every day in a very direct way. Everything from nurses, aides, to home health care workers, retirement home workers, even the janitorial staff that works in healthcare environments, putting more people at risk. 2/3 of Black folks are in the states that have below median testing rates. And then as we mentioned before, on comorbidity and underlying conditions, 30% of Black Americans have some version of these underlying conditions. And so these factors tend to lead to, amongst others, lead to that disproportionate impact, amongst other things.
Jason, if I can interrupt you, question here that's interesting. I'm not sure if we have the research, but on high contact essential work and overrepresentation, do we have research there that takes gender into account and the differences between how Black men and Black women are faring during this crisis?
Yeah, this is an important one, and I'll run through it quickly. But we did a report on the future of work in Black America prior to COVID, the impact of automation on the African American workforce. And it's not cheery reading, okay? Just warning you. But one of the bright points was that when you adjusted for gender, Black women actually are predicted to fare better in the future economy from an employment standpoint, if not an income standpoint, an employment standpoint, than even the average white person in the global or in the U.S. economy. And that is because Black women are disproportionately represented in high-growth healthcare sector jobs. However, COVID has taken away even that bright spot, because these are the same Black women that are forward-facing and at most risk to the disease, often primary breadwinners in their household. And so the loss of income and potentially the long-term health implications of those folks who were likely to carry Black America economically into the future economy with some strength are now being disproportionately impacted. So it's a very worrying one, along with Black businesses, which we'll get into. So let's go to what's next and fly through a bit. So we'll talk through the impact of COVID using that same framework. So let's talk through community context first. Black Americans are, based on from a comparative standpoint, use more public services than average. So that means things like public transportation, food assistance that both have disruptions, and when they are delivered, have more risk of coming into contact with COVID-19, are putting Black folks more at risk. And one of the things that I'll highlight that can help to solve this is number 2 here down in potential solutions. And that's investing in critical community assets and enablers. And specifically, I want to dive deep here on digital infrastructure. This is a bit of my stump speech. But what we found in some of our meta-research was that 36% of Black families do not have access to reliable broadband or a personal computer, compared to 20% of white families, compared to 11% of Asian American families. What that means in practice in COVID is that it's a triple whammy against Black families. Number one, in a work-from-home environment, you are more likely to be furloughed, have reduced hours, or at least have your career progression hindered because of your inability to execute your job with excellence. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Number two, if your kids are in school, K-12 or higher education, likelihood of completion, ability to get a full academic course load are severely hindered, and the achievement gap that already exists between Black students and white students is widening in this moment, as we see. And then number three, the ability to get your actual healthcare access. Telehealth is the mode of the day. And so being able to manage underlying systems and even more so actually managing COVID symptoms is severely hindered in Black families. And so some solution that is able to permanently fix the inequity or the imbalance in digital infrastructure for Black communities would be really immense. And that crosses urban and rural areas. It exists everywhere. And I think that would help not just in the context of COVID, but in the hopeful sharp V recovery that comes out of this, better positioning Black folks to effectively participate in the economy. And I gotta believe, I'm not a tech guy, but I gotta believe there's a margin-making way to do this where it doesn't have to be charity. There's enough smart folks in the government working with social sector entities and tech companies to make something happen there. So I'll go to what's next on family income. Talked a little bit about the future of work already. And already there is a roughly 5% elevated risk of Black jobs being lost due to the future of work and automation. Now this comes on top of that and says in the context of COVID, because of where Black workers are positioned, they are 39% of those jobs are considered vulnerable versus 34% of white workers' jobs. And where I think there's an opportunity to both try to help with the near-term problem as well as make progress on this longer-term future of work challenge is bullet number 2 here. We have, for a long time in the private sector, thrown around the word reskilling. And I don't know that we as corporate entities have really made good on that promise. But now with reduced hours, partial work days in many aspects, there is capacity to actually double down on some of these reskilling programs, on digital and analytic capabilities, positioning people in high-growth, tech-enabled jobs of the future. And there's a chance right now to oversample from Black and brown workers so that they are equitably positioned in those growth environments going forward. So I think it's a huge opportunity to do some of this job matching and reskilling programs that we've talked about for some time. Now let's go to family wealth. As you know, there are several sectors that are harder hit by the economic drawback due to COVID-19. Retail, hospitality, travel and leisure, the list goes on. 25% of all U.S. business revenues are in those sectors. 40% of Black business revenues are in those sectors. And actually 50% of Latinx-owned business revenues are in those sectors. And because these represent such a substantial nest egg for Black families, it is a major driver of inheritance. It is a job creator for Black communities and Black people as well. This is really an essential one. And so ensuring that both through the interventions that come through policy and those that can happen in the private sector through reassessing your vendor pipelines and things like that. It is such a critical time to support Black businesses in any way, shape, or form. I really am concerned if these Black businesses go defunct during this time period, we will see that wealth gap rapidly expand, and that 17,000 can get close to zero. I know some colleagues at the Milken Institute have actually predicted that. And so let's talk last about family savings and support. 52% of Black families say that that COVID is a major threat to their personal financial situation versus 43% of white families. But that doesn't even capture the starting point on this and the calibration. So those same white families, their normal comfort level is having 31 days of liquidity on average. That's how much they had in liquid savings. The average Black family starting point of their comfort level is having 5 days of liquid savings on average. And so not only are we saying, as Black folks, we are more at risk, but that's in addition to an already riskier starting point. And so it's really important to think about access to capital, an evergreen topic of discussion around racial equity in a more robust and very pragmatic way right now. And there's some great thinking about that from leaders like Robert Smith and thinking about injecting capital into CDFIs and MDIs that are more apt at working with communities of color. And so maybe pivoting a bit from the heavy focus on the research into what this means pragmatically for us as companies, especially as so many of us as institutions are looking for our way to respond to the broader racial dialogue that's happening, not just around racial economic inequity, but the social justice narrative that's currently sweeping the nation. And I think many of us have felt compelled to respond and do something with the assets and influence that we all have as business leaders. And so our research, and we didn't go into this as deeply, but you'll see it, especially in our first report on the racial wealth gap, that we actually see all of these solutions that I talked about fitting into a narrative about injecting capital where there's been historic disinvestment of capital in Black communities. At one point by law, and more tacitly now, built into algorithmic injustice and other things like that. But there's physical capital as actual assets, providing those to Black communities in due share. Intellectual capital, that's access to knowledge, resource, best practices that are often not provided. And relational capital, that's proximity to decision making and the ability to make decisions with some agency for Black individuals and communities. And we have found in our research that those three types of capital are what we predict will drive disproportionate outcomes for Black individuals and Black communities. And so, of course, when we pivoted inward to say, what the heck is Mackinsey going to do in this specific moment, we trusted our research. And on the screen right here, you'll see the 10 actions that we came to as a firm. And across those 10 actions, you'll see a bit of the theme of these three types of capital. I'll start with relational capital, and that's having, again, proximity to decision-making, the ability to have agency as a Black individual or community. In number one, doubling our Black leadership and hiring of Black colleagues over the next 4 years is all about that. If we have more Black leaders at Mackinsey, more Black people are going to make decisions on the direction of the firm, and we believe that by default, we will be making more equitable decisions, or even better decisions, frankly, is what our research says before on Diversity Matters, that diverse leadership teams make better decisions and create more EBITDA over time as well. But even especially from a racial equity lens and the way we impact communities with our client work, we think that is going to make a huge difference. And then if you look at numbers 5 and 6 on here, our Leadership Academy, that's taking our McKinsey Academy capabilities that are all about building leaders, helping them accelerate their career trajectory, providing circumspect views on their leadership capacity and problem-solving capabilities. And number 6, which is all this research that you've seen, providing research and data to the marketplace. We want to make sure that we are providing intellectual capital with 5 and 6 to Black communities, Black leaders, and those supporting them. And then number 7 and number 10 here, and a little bit of 8 and 9, is about infusing direct capital, physical capital, to diverse suppliers, which are Black and Brown-owned businesses, as well as getting money into the hands of Black-led organizations that have the proximity, trust, and track record of driving outcomes for Black communities. And so I'll pause there with the few minutes we have left to see if there's any other questions that have come in or anything we want to close with.
Yeah, we've had a lot of interesting questions, including on whether we've done this research in other geographies, in England, for example, what the role is of engineering schools and STEM programs. Great questions coming in. But I'm going to ask two to close. One is, we see a lot of companies engaging in this kind of explicit response to define purpose and a response to recent events. How do we ensure that purpose doesn't kind of devolve into PR, as seems to have happened at some points in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. How is this not just window dressing and dancing, right?
Yeah.
It's a great question. I think there's, maybe three things I'd offer up. The first is in the design of your initiatives and your approach. Specificity is really important. We tried our best to do that. As you see on the page, there's a lot of numbers on the page, classic Mackinsey, but that's also purposeful, because there are things here that we will be able to measure ourselves against. Doubling our Black leadership and hiring a Black colleague is not a fungible number. Neither is 4 years. Those things exist. And so I think it's as specific as you can be around the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, the better. Number two is there is a senior leader, a senior partner at Mackinsey, actually multiple senior partners, who have been assigned to each of these initiatives across every region. And as they are reviewed by their peers, this is going to be in their review criteria. Did they move the needle substantially towards these goals or not? And those are not Black folks either. These are allies, champions, firm senior leaders who actually have the sway to make decisions and changes here. And I think that's important too, bringing it into whatever accountability structure exists. And then the last thing that I think is important, and I'll highlight initiatives 2 and 3 here, especially a little bit of 4, but it's making sure that whatever effort you're doing is embedded in the broader org culture and health initiatives that you're doing as a company, and that you allow, anti-racism or racial equity or whatever your chosen favorite, woke term is actually embedded into your DNA as a company. And so number 2, we're doing this anti-racism and inclusion training across all 32,000 colleges. That's going to be really hard. I was just on a design session today. It's going to be really difficult because every region is super bespoke in their racial history. But we're going to do that because this is how it's going to become part of how we speak, the language we use as a firm, and our connective tissue in our culture. And so I think those 3 things, insofar as you can design those in, will be, very efficacious.
Great, that's helpful. Okay, one last question. We're just up on the hour. A lot of interest in your personal perspective, and you as a human. You've been involved in all this research. You've been involved in crafting these solutions. Are you optimistic? What do you think about what's coming next?
Look, y'all, I smile a lot, but it belies a deep cynicism. I'm the progeny of several generations of civil rights activists. So on topics of race, I tend to be, quite cynical. I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop on things like this because progress has been so intractable over time. But I'll tell you what, and also I came from a background of a majority Black work environment before coming to Mackinsey, which was quite the shock. Mackinsey is definitely not the majority Black work environment, but I played in the NFL for almost 10 years. And so that cynicism runs deep. That said, the conversation around race and equity is usually a flash in the pan. There's an event that happens, or a workplace has their own personal reckoning, usually on the talent dimensions or personnel conduct dimensions, and then it goes away. But this dialogue started back in February, and I have seen no momentum shift in it. There, as you said, Lucy, there was an article this week in the New York Times. The New York Times continues to run articles on it. So do others. The fact that this has been sticky in the dialogue, and that people are talking about it who did not talk about it before, and that it's dimensionalized not just as a moral cause, but also an economic imperative, gives me a lot of confidence. And so I'm high on hope in this moment, and I hope you are too.
It's great to hear. Jason, thank you so much. That was a great discussion. We really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today. Everyone, on behalf of Mackinsey Live, we thank all of you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to your feedback in this super quick 10-second survey you're going to see when you close your event console. Please visit our website, mckinsey.com, for more on closing the racial wealth gap, accelerating financial inclusion, and other insights. And be sure to register for next week's webinar, Returning to the Workplace, what we can learn from essential businesses that have stayed open throughout the pandemic. See you there. Have a great day or evening. Be well.